I used to believe I had the kind of marriage that other men envied. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was solid. I met Laura in college, back when we were both young and full of dreams. She was the kind of woman who could light up a room without even trying. She had this effortless charm, the kind that made people feel comfortable around her. I fell for her quickly, and she fell for me too, or at least I thought she did. We built a life together. Got married in a small ceremony, bought a house, and settled into a routine that felt safe. She worked as a marketing executive, always busy, always moving. I was an engineer, more grounded, more structured. Our differences balanced us out in ways that made sense. We complemented each other. Or so I thought. Years passed, and we became parents to two beautiful children, a boy and a girl. Parenthood changed everything, as it does for most couples, but I never once doubted Laura's love for me. She was an incredible mother, attentive and nurturing. If there were cracks in our relationship, I was too blind to see them. I worked long hours, making sure we had everything we needed, a good home, savings, a future. Laura worked too, and we juggled our responsibilities like every other married couple. We made time for each other when we could, date nights, vacations, small moments of intimacy that reminded us why we fell in love in the first place. But looking back, I realized now that something had shifted. It was so gradual, so subtle, that I never recognized it for what it was. She was always on her phone more often, texting, smiling at messages she never shared. She started staying late at work, making excuses about deadlines and client meetings. I trusted her completely, never even considered questioning it. That's what marriage was supposed to be, right? Built on trust? I never wanted to be the kind of husband who accused his wife of something just because of a gut feeling. I ignored the small doubts that occasionally crept in. We had been married for over a decade when she told me she was pregnant again. It was a surprise, completely unplanned. We had never talked about having a third child, but when she told me, I felt nothing but happiness. A new baby meant a fresh start, another chance to strengthen our bond as a family. But in the back of my mind, something nagged at me. I told myself it was just nerves, just the stress of adding another child into our already busy lives. I didn't know then that this baby would be the thing that shattered everything I thought I knew about my wife, my marriage, and myself. The months leading up to the baby's birth were a blur of preparation. We turned the guest room into a nursery, painted the walls a soft shade of blue, and spent our weekends assembling furniture, picking out clothes, and stocking up on diapers. It felt familiar, comforting even. I told myself that if Laura had been distant before, it was just because of the pregnancy. Hormones, stress, exhaustion, it was normal. She seemed happier, more energetic. There were moments when I caught her staring at me, her expression unreadable, like she was studying me. When I asked her what she was thinking, she would just smile and shake her head. Nothing, she'd say. But it never felt like nothing. I worked hard to be there for her. I started leaving the office earlier, making dinner when she was too tired to cook, rubbing her back at night when she couldn't sleep. She thanked me, always with that same distant smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. I convinced myself that she was just tired, that she would return to her old self after the baby arrived. Our kids were excited about having a new sibling. They would talk to her belly, guessing if the baby would look more like mom or dad. I joked that another me in the house would be too much to handle, but Laura would only laugh lightly, never really engaging in the conversation. At one of her later doctor's appointments, I offered to come with her. She hesitated, then told me not to worry about it. "It's just a routine checkup," she assured me. "Nothing exciting." I didn't push. I wanted to respect her space, to not be overbearing. Looking back, I should have insisted. As her due date approached, I noticed small things: her reluctance to be affectionate, the way she turned away when I tried to kiss her. The warmth that once existed between us had cooled. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that she was just overwhelmed. But then there were other moments, fleeting but sharp, where I saw something else in her eyes. Guilt. I ignored it. I loved my wife, and I refused to believe she would ever betray me. The day finally came. I held her hand in the hospital as she gave birth to our son. When the doctor placed him in her arms, she cried, but they weren't the tears of joy I expected. It was something else, something heavier. I held him next, tracing the tiny features of his face, overwhelmed with love. But as I looked down at him, a strange thought crept into my mind. A thought I didn't want to have. Something felt off. I pushed it away, told myself I was imagining things. After all, he was just a newborn. Babies change as they grow. I had no idea that this moment, this tiny whisper of doubt, was the beginning of the end. Bringing our son home should have been one of the happiest moments of my life. I wanted it to be. I wanted to believe that this new chapter would bring Laura and me closer together, that the exhaustion and stress would fade, and we'd fall back into the rhythm we once had. But something had shifted, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't right. Laura was different. Distant. I had expected her to be tired, overwhelmed, even emotional. She had just given birth, after all. But this was something else. There was a weight in her eyes, a stiffness in her touch when I reached for her. She went through the motions of motherhood, but it felt forced, rehearsed. She wasn't glowing the way she had with our other children. She was retreating. I told myself it was postpartum hormones, that I was reading too much into things. But I saw how she avoided being alone with me, how she would pull away when I wrapped an arm around her, how she kept her phone close, locking the screen whenever I was near. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, that I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't ignore the way my presence seemed to make her uneasy. She had always been affectionate, always leaned into me when we sat together on the couch, always reached for my hand absent-mindedly when we walked side by side. But now, there was a gap between us, an invisible but undeniable distance, and no matter how much I tried to close it, she never met me halfway. It was as if something had shifted inside her, and I didn't know how to fix it. And then there was our son. I loved him. I loved him the moment I saw him, but there were moments, quiet, fleeting moments, where an uneasy feeling gnawed at me. I told myself he was just a newborn, that it was too soon to tell who he would take after, that all babies look like wrinkled little strangers in the beginning. But late at night, when I cradled him in my arms and studied his face, I felt something I couldn't explain. Doubt. It made me feel sick. I had no reason to question anything. Laura was my wife. This was my son. And yet the thought kept coming back, a whisper that turned into a scream inside my head. I began noticing more things, how Laura flinched when I brought up the pregnancy, how she never looked me in the eye when we talked about the future. She was hiding something. One night, a few weeks after we brought him home, I was standing over his crib, watching him sleep. Laura was in the shower. The house was quiet. I studied every inch of his tiny face, his nose, his lips, his eyes. And that's when I felt it, deep in my gut. I couldn't see myself in him. I tried to push it away, to tell myself I was being irrational. But once the thought took hold, it didn't let go. It started consuming me, gnawing at me from the inside out. I tried to ignore it, to push the thought deep down and forget it ever existed, but it kept resurfacing in the quiet moments, in the gaps of silence that had begun to stretch between Laura and me. I started watching her more closely, paying attention to the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she avoided certain topics. She thought I didn't notice, but I did. The way her breath hitched when I mentioned the baby's features, the way she never called him ours, the way she had with our other children. There was something there, just beneath the surface, something she wasn't saying. I wanted to believe I was imagining it, that I was just exhausted from work and sleepless nights, that I was looking for signs that didn't exist. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Doubt had crept into my marriage, and once it was there, it spread like poison. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to discover the truth. And it would destroy everything. The unease settled into my bones, a slow, suffocating weight that refused to leave. I tried to shake it off, bury it beneath the distractions of everyday life, work, the kids, the endless responsibilities that came with being a husband and father. But no matter how much I tried to pretend everything was normal, the feeling remained, growing stronger with each passing day. I wanted to believe Laura's distance was nothing more than exhaustion, that the tension between us was just the result of new parenthood. But deep down, I knew better. I had known her for years, knew the way she carried herself, the way her emotions played out in small, almost imperceptible gestures. And I knew, without a doubt, that she was hiding something from me. I started noticing things I had ignored before, things that should have alarmed me but that I had foolishly dismissed in my blind trust. The way she flinched when I touched her, the way she kept her phone glued to her hand, silencing notifications and turning the screen away whenever I entered the room. She had never been secretive with her phone before. We had always been open with each other, never feeling the need to lock our devices or hide things. Now, it was different. If I walked by while she was texting, she would immediately put the phone down, forcing a casual smile that never quite reached her eyes. At night, when she thought I was asleep, I could hear the faint tapping of her fingers against the screen, messages being sent in the quiet dark. I wanted to believe she was talking to friends, maybe venting about the struggles of having a newborn. But my gut told me otherwise. And then there were the unexplained absences. At first, they were small, errands that took longer than they should, sudden trips to the store for things we didn't urgently need. Then, they became more frequent. She started going out more, needing fresh air or time to clear her head. I never questioned her, because why would I? She was my wife, the mother of my children. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and now, every moment she was away from me, I couldn't stop wondering where she really was. One afternoon, I came home early from work. She hadn't been expecting me. The house was quiet, eerily so, and when I walked inside, I felt an uneasiness settle over me. I checked the nursery. Our son was asleep in his crib. But Laura was nowhere to be found. I pulled out my phone and called her. It rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. A few minutes later, I heard the front door open. She froze when she saw me standing in the living room. Her face went pale for the briefest second before she forced a smile, shifting the bag in her hands. "I just ran out to get some diapers," she said, her voice too light, too casual. I glanced at the bag. Inside was a bottle of wine, a loaf of bread, and some fruit, no diapers. I looked back at her, and she knew. She knew I had caught her in a lie, but instead of explaining, she simply walked past me, placing the bag on the counter. It should have been a small thing. A forgotten errand. A mistake. But it wasn't. It was another crack in the foundation of our marriage, another sign that the woman I trusted was slipping further and further away from me. That night, when she fell asleep, I reached for her phone. My hands were shaking as I stared at the locked screen. I knew her passcode, or at least I thought I did. But when I tried it, the screen flashed red. Wrong password. My stomach turned. She had changed it. And just like that I knew. There was someone else. The realization hit me like a slow-moving wreck, not all at once, but in pieces that settled heavily in my chest. Laura was cheating. I didn't want to believe it, didn't want to accept that the woman I had built my life with had betrayed me, but the evidence was undeniable. The secrecy, the distance, the late nights with her phone glowing in the darkness, everything I had ignored now painted a clear picture of the truth I had been too blind to see. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling while she slept beside me. I wanted to shake her awake and demand the truth, to force her to admit what she had done, but I didn't. Instead, I let the silence stretch between us, a suffocating barrier that neither of us acknowledged. I needed more than suspicions. I needed proof. Because once I confronted her, there would be no going back. The next morning, I started watching her more closely, taking note of the things I had ignored before. She had become careful, too careful, but even the most cautious person leaves cracks in their deception. I started checking her car's mileage, tracking how far she drove when she went on her errands. I paid attention to her patterns, when she left, when she returned, how long she took to reply to messages. The inconsistencies piled up. She wasn't just lying to me, she had been doing it for a while. Then came the moment that confirmed it. A week after I tried to unlock her phone, she left it on the kitchen counter while she took a shower. It buzzed once. Then again. A name I didn't recognize flashed across the screen. A man's name. The text preview showed only a few words, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. Miss you already? I had to sit down. My hands trembled, my breath shallow, my mind racing with the weight of it. There was no mistaking what I had seen. No more doubts. No more excuses. It was real. Laura wasn't just distant, she was in love with someone else. I put the phone down before she could catch me looking at it, but from that moment on, everything changed. I couldn't look at her the same way. Every word she spoke felt tainted, every touch a lie. I wanted to confront her, but I wasn't ready. I needed to know how deep it went, how long it had been happening, how much of our life had been built on a lie. So, I did something I never thought I would do. I followed her. The opportunity presented itself 2 days later when she claimed she was meeting a friend for lunch. I waited for her to leave, then got into my car and tailed her at a distance. She drove across town, past the restaurants where she usually met her friends, past the shopping district, past anything that resembled a casual lunch spot. My heart pounded as she pulled into the parking lot of a small hotel. I sat in my car, watching as she got out, her movements quick, nervous. She glanced around, checking to see if anyone was watching. Then, she walked toward the entrance. A minute later, a man stepped out of another car and followed her inside. I didn't need to see his face to know what was happening. Laura was having an affair. And suddenly, I wasn't just a husband anymore. I was a fool. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stared at the hotel entrance, half expecting Laura to turn around, to hesitate, to realize what she was about to do and stop herself. But she didn't. She walked inside without a second thought, disappearing through those doors like it was the most natural thing in the world. And then, just minutes later, he followed. I didn't recognize him. He was younger than me, maybe by a few years, dressed well, moving with an air of confidence that made my stomach turn. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't some casual flirtation that had gone too far. This was a full-blown affair, something premeditated, something deliberate. The kind of betrayal that doesn't happen overnight but builds over time, fueled by secrecy and lies. I had been blind to it, but now, sitting there in the driver's seat, I saw it for what it was. I wanted to storm inside. I wanted to grab him by the collar, drag him out, make him face me. I wanted Laura to see me standing there, wanted her to realize that she had been caught, that all the lies and excuses were worthless now. But I didn't move. Not because I was afraid, not because I didn't have the right to demand answers, but because in that moment, I felt something worse than anger. I felt humiliation. My wife was in that hotel room with another man, and there was nothing I could do to undo it. Nothing I could do to erase the fact that while I had been at home taking care of our children, she had been here, in a cheap, dimly lit room, giving herself to someone else. How many times had she done this? How many nights had I kissed her, touched her, made love to her, while she was thinking about him? How long had I been living in a marriage that was already dead? I sat there for nearly an hour, staring at the entrance, waiting for her to come out. When she finally did, she looked different. Lighter. As if she had shed a burden I hadn't even known she carried. She ran a hand through her hair, smoothing it down, checked her reflection in her phone screen, and adjusted her clothes before walking to her car. She didn't look around, didn't hesitate. She just got in and drove away. Like it was nothing. I stayed behind, watching as the man exited a few minutes later. He wasn't in a hurry. He stretched his arms, glanced at his phone, then walked casually to his car. Not a care in the world. Not a single thought about the man whose wife he had just slept with. I followed Laura home, staying a few cars behind so she wouldn't suspect anything. By the time I walked through the front door, she was already in the kitchen, acting like nothing had happened. She smiled at me, asked about my day, even kissed my cheek. I felt sick. I wanted to push her away, to tell her I knew, to scream at her for what she had done. But instead I stood there, silent, my stomach twisting with disgust. I couldn't confront her. Not yet. Not until I knew everything. Because as much as I wanted to believe this was something new, something recent, I had a feeling it wasn't. The distance, the secrecy, the pregnancy, it all connected in a way I didn't want to admit. A new fear settled in my chest, heavy and suffocating. What if this wasn't just an affair? What if this man wasn't just her lover? What if he was the father of my child? The weight of my suspicions pressed down on me, suffocating and inescapable. My wife had betrayed me. I knew that now, but the question that clawed at my mind was how far her betrayal went. An affair was one thing, but the thought that the child I had spent months loving, caring for, and believing to be mine could belong to another man? That was something else entirely. That was a wound I wasn't sure I could survive. I began replaying everything in my head, the timeline, the moments I had dismissed, the way she had reacted when she found out she was pregnant. It had been a surprise to us both, but now I wondered if she had been surprised for a different reason. Had she known all along? Had she spent those months hoping the baby would come out looking enough like me to erase any doubts? Had she planned to keep this secret buried forever? I watched her more carefully than ever in the days that followed. I studied the way she looked at our son, the way she hesitated just slightly when I referred to him as ours. I noticed how she avoided my gaze whenever I brought up his features, how she never commented when relatives said he didn't look much like me. It was all there, hidden in plain sight, the cracks in her lies widening by the second. I knew I had to get a DNA test. The thought of it made me sick, as if just entertaining the idea was a betrayal of my son, but I couldn't ignore it. I needed the truth, no matter how much it hurt. I started researching testing options, trying to figure out how I could do it without Laura knowing. I didn't want to tip her off, didn't want her to have time to prepare a defense, to weave another web of lies. I needed to be certain before I confronted her, before I shattered the life we had built beyond repair. The opportunity came one night when Laura fell asleep early. I had spent hours lying awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind consumed by the uncertainty that had taken over my life. When I was sure she was asleep, I slipped out of bed and went to the nursery. Our son was sleeping peacefully, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. I hesitated for a long time, my hands trembling as I reached for him. He was innocent in all of this. No matter what the test said, he didn't deserve any of this. I took a deep breath and carefully swabbed the inside of his cheek, sealing the sample in a sterile bag before tucking it away. I took another swab of my own and packaged them together, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might wake the entire house. When it was done, I stood over his crib, watching him sleep, feeling a crushing mix of love and dread. No matter what happened next, everything was about to change. The next morning, I sent the test off to the lab. I told myself I wouldn't think about it until the results arrived, but that was impossible. Every moment with Laura felt like a lie. Every glance at my son filled me with fear. I started to withdraw, my patience running thin, my body wound so tight I felt like I might snap at any moment. Laura noticed, of course, but I played it off as stress, work, exhaustion, anything to keep her from suspecting the real reason behind my mood. The days dragged by, each one heavier than the last. And then, finally, the results arrived. My hands were shaking as I opened the email, my stomach twisting into knots. The words blurred together at first, my vision swimming, my pulse thundering in my ears. But then I saw it. The confirmation that would rip my life apart. Probability of paternity, 0%. I dropped the phone, the air leaving my lungs in one sharp, excruciating gasp. I had suspected it, feared it, but seeing it in black and white made it real in a way that nothing else had. The child I had held in my arms, the child I had loved as my own, was not mine. Laura had lied to me. She had stolen something from me that could never be replaced. Rage burned through me, blinding and absolute. There was no more doubt, no more hesitation. She had taken everything from me, my trust, my love, my family, and now, she was going to face the consequences. I stood up, my hands clenched into fists, my entire body shaking. It was time to confront my wife. The rage consumed me, turning everything into a blur of red and betrayal. My hands trembled, my breath came in sharp, uneven gasps, and for a moment, I felt like I was outside of my own body, watching myself spiral. I had spent weeks drowning in doubt, in paranoia, in the quiet agony of not knowing. But now I knew. Now I had proof. And there was nothing left to hold me back. Laura had lied to me. She had spent months letting me believe I was this child's father, letting me hold him, bond with him, love him, all while knowing the truth. And she would have let me go on believing it forever. She would have let me raise another man's child, would have let me pour my love, my time, my life into a lie. I could feel my hands shaking, could hear the blood rushing in my ears, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't going to explode, not yet. I wanted to see her face when I told her. I wanted to watch the moment she realized that her perfect little secret had come crashing down around her. I found her in the kitchen, humming softly as she chopped vegetables for dinner. It was a normal evening, just like any other, and that made me sick. She had no idea what was coming. No idea that everything she had built with her lies was about to be torn apart. I stood there for a moment, watching her, my stomach twisting with a sickening mix of fury and heartbreak. How had I not seen it before? How had I been so blind? I stepped forward, my voice low, controlled, but laced with venom. I told her I had taken a DNA test. I told her I knew. The words hit her like a physical blow. The knife she was holding clattered onto the cutting board, her entire body going still. She didn't speak. Didn't try to deny it. She just stood there, frozen, her face draining of color. And then, finally, she whispered my name, like that was supposed to mean something. Like it would undo everything. But it was too late for that. I didn't want explanations. I didn't want excuses. I wanted her gone. I told her to pack her things. I told her to take the baby that wasn't mine, and leave. I wasn't going to raise another man's child. I wasn't going to live under the same roof with a woman who had betrayed me in the worst way possible. She started crying, begging, saying things that I couldn't even process through the roaring in my head. But I didn't care. I was done listening to her lies. I walked away, grabbed a suitcase from the bedroom, and threw it onto the floor in front of her. I told her again to leave, my voice sharp, final. She hesitated, like she thought there was still a chance to fix this, like she thought she could manipulate her way out of it. But when she looked into my eyes, she saw the truth. There was nothing left between us. Whatever love I had for her had been poisoned beyond repair. She packed in silence, her hands shaking as she shoved clothes into the suitcase. I stood there, watching, making sure she didn't take a second longer than necessary. When she was done, she turned to me one last time, her eyes red, her face twisted in something that almost looked like regret. But I didn't care. I opened the door, motioned for her to leave, and when she finally stepped outside, I shut it behind her without another word. I locked the door. Stood there, staring at it, listening to the sound of her footsteps fading. And then, for the first time since this nightmare began, I let myself breathe. Laura was gone. And now, all that was left was to make it official. I was filing for divorce. The house was silent, but not the kind of silence that brings peace. It was the kind that settles in after destruction, the kind that fills the space where something used to be. Laura was gone. The baby, her baby, was gone. And I was left standing in the ruins of a life I had once believed was solid, unbreakable. But it had been a lie, all of it. Every kiss, every promise, every whispered, "I love you," had been laced with deceit. I stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door, at the space where she had just been, waiting to feel something other than rage. Maybe sadness? Maybe relief. But there was nothing. Just emptiness. The house felt different now, even though nothing had changed. Her shoes weren't by the door. Her coat no longer hung on the hook. The faint smell of her perfume still lingered, but it was already fading. It was amazing, really, how quickly someone's presence could be erased. Just a few bags, a few steps out the door, and a life built over years could disappear. But the scars she left behind weren't so easy to remove. I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of divorce papers I had printed earlier that day. I had prepared for this, knew exactly what needed to be done. I didn't want to fight over assets, didn't care about splitting furniture or deciding who got what. I just wanted it over. I wanted my name off hers, wanted the legal ties that bound us to be severed as quickly as possible. I picked up the pen and signed my name at the bottom. It should have felt like closure. It should have felt like taking back control. But all I felt was exhaustion, like every ounce of energy had been drained from me. This wasn't just the end of my marriage, it was the end of the life I thought I had. I pushed the papers aside and leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes. For a brief, fleeting moment, I let my mind wander back to the past, back to the early days when Laura and I were young, when love had been simple. I remembered the way she used to look at me, the way she used to smile, how she once made me feel like the luckiest man in the world. And then I remembered the hotel, the text message, the DNA results. That woman, the one I had built my life with, was gone. Maybe she had been gone for a long time. I opened my eyes and exhaled slowly. No more looking back. No more wondering when it all went wrong. None of it mattered anymore. I picked up the divorce papers, placed them in an envelope, and set them by the door. Tomorrow, I would send them off. Tomorrow, I would begin whatever came next. For the first time in years, I was alone. But for the first time in weeks, I wasn't drowning in uncertainty. I knew what I had to do. Laura had made her choices. Now, I was making mine. The divorce process moved forward faster than I expected, but not fast enough for me. Every day that passed with Laura's name still legally tied to mine felt like a weight I couldn't shake. I wanted her out of my life completely, erased in every way that mattered. I didn't respond to her messages, ignored every attempt she made to talk, and kept things strictly between our lawyers. There was nothing left to say. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. She didn't fight me on much, which only fueled my anger. She agreed to leave the house, didn't push for any shared custody of our other children, didn't try to drag out the process. Maybe she felt guilty. Maybe she just wanted to move on as quickly as I did. But I couldn't bring myself to care. The damage had already been done. Whether she regretted it or not didn't change the fact that she had lied to me, that she had let me believe her betrayal was my child. The only thing that slowed the process was the baby. Legally, my name was still on the birth certificate. I was listed as the father, which meant I had to go through the process of removing myself, of officially severing any legal responsibility. Seeing my name on that document, next to a child that wasn't mine, filled me with a rage I couldn't put into words. It was like a final slap in the face, a reminder of just how deeply Laura had betrayed me. I filed to have my name removed, sent in the DNA results as proof, and waited. It felt like an eternity before it was finalized. When the official document came in the mail, I sat there staring at it for a long time. My name was gone. It was over. The child I had once believed was mine was nothing more than a painful memory now. It should have felt like closure, but it didn't. It felt hollow. The house was quieter without Laura in it. At first, it was a relief. I didn't have to pretend anymore, didn't have to force smiles or push down the anger boiling inside me. But as the days passed, the silence started to weigh on me. Everything in the house reminded me of her. The bed we used to share, the coffee cups in the cabinet, the framed pictures I hadn't taken down yet. Even the smallest things, the scent of her shampoo still lingering in the bathroom, the empty space where her shoes used to be by the door, felt like ghosts haunting every corner of my home. I didn't want to mourn her, but in a way, I was. Not the person she had become, but the person I thought she was. The life I thought we had. It was dead now, and I had to figure out how to move forward. The day our divorce was finalized, I didn't celebrate. There was no relief, no satisfaction, just an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. I had spent weeks carrying the weight of my rage, my pain, my humiliation. And now, I was just tired. That night, I sat outside on the porch with a beer in my hand, staring out into the darkness. I had no idea what came next. The life I had built with Laura was gone, and for the first time in years, I had no plan, no direction. But maybe that was a good thing. Maybe, for the first time in a long time, I had the chance to start over. Life didn't go back to normal after the divorce because there was no normal anymore. Everything that had once defined my world, my marriage, my trust, my sense of stability, was gone. In its place was a silence I didn't know how to fill, an emptiness that stretched into every corner of my life. I had spent so much time focused on the betrayal, the anger, the pain, that I hadn't stopped to consider what came after. And now that it was over, now that Laura was officially out of my life, I was left standing in the wreckage of everything we had built, wondering what the hell I was supposed to do next. I threw myself into work, burying my days in meetings, deadlines, anything that kept my mind occupied. But no matter how much I distracted myself, the quiet moments still crept in, the moments where I'd catch myself glancing at my phone, expecting a message from someone who no longer existed in my world. The moments where I'd wake up in the middle of the night and instinctively reach for the other side of the bed, only to find it empty. The moments where I'd hear a baby crying in a grocery store and feel that painful, automatic pang of connection before remembering that the child I had once thought was mine had never been mine at all. My kids kept me going. They were my anchor, the only proof that something real had come from my marriage. They had questions, of course. They were old enough to know something had happened, old enough to notice that their mother had left without much of an explanation. I didn't give them details. I didn't want to poison them against her, didn't want my anger to become theirs. I just told them that things hadn't worked out between us, that sometimes people make mistakes that can't be undone. And maybe that was enough. Laura tried to reach out a few times. At first, I ignored her, deleting her messages without reading them, refusing to pick up when her number appeared on my screen. But eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I read one of her messages late one night, alone in the house we used to share. It was an apology, though not the kind that mattered. She didn't beg me to take her back, she knew better than that. Instead, she tried to explain. She said she never meant for it to happen, that she had felt lost, that she had made mistakes she couldn't take back. But in the end, none of it mattered. She had made her choices. And I had made mine. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Time moved forward, whether I was ready for it or not. The months passed, the pain dulled, the memories blurred at the edges. I started going out again, reconnecting with old friends, learning how to live a life that wasn't tethered to Laura's shadow. And somewhere along the way, I realized something. I was free. The anger, the betrayal, the humiliation, it had all weighed me down for so long that I hadn't noticed when it started to lift. But one day, I woke up and it wasn't the first thing on my mind. One day, I looked in the mirror and saw a man who had survived something that should have broken him. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like myself again. Laura had taken a lot from me. She had stolen my trust, my sense of security, my belief in the life we had built. But she hadn't destroyed me. She hadn't taken everything. And as I stood outside one evening, watching the sun sink behind the horizon, I knew that whatever came next, whatever life had in store for me, I was ready. Because I wasn't the man who had sat in that hospital room, holding a child that wasn't his. I wasn't the man who had followed his wife to a hotel, watching his world crumble. I wasn't the man who had signed those divorce papers, drowning in the weight of what he had lost. I was something else now. Something stronger. And I was finally moving on.